Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch video, and today we're taking a look at a really cool custom watch from a company called Artisans De Geneve. So as with all my reviews, let's go back in time and look at the history of this brand. It's a really brief history because they have not been around for that long. We're just going to take a look at the history of the brand and also what they're about, what their philosophy is and what sort of watches they create. So Artisans De Geneve is based in Geneva. They are a group of independent watchmakers, and the company was actually founded in 2005, so it's a relatively young brand. They specialize, and they're a completely independent watchmaking house as well. They're built up of independent watchmakers. Independent watchmaking house, meaning that they're not, governed by what they can do by another brand or, working alongside Omega. For example, Overfinch and Range Rover work together on their cars, and, Overfinch and Range Rover have a good relationship, whereas Artisans De Geneve is completely on their own. They don't involve themselves in Rolex at all. Lots of companies over the years have been doing custom watches, like Bamford watches. Blackout PVC coating was a really popular custom watch about 5 years ago. Lots and lots of people like to buy that. Now not as popular, kind of less and less we're seeing people customizing watches and actually just keeping them stock. Obviously icing out watches was really popular as well 10, 15 years ago, kind of 5 or 10 years ago, and has become much less popular now. People actually prefer to keep them completely stock. So kind of unusual for us to be looking at a custom watch here at Bijou, but this is a really unique watch and unique custom company, and that's what I want to talk about, why I want to talk to you about them. So yeah, independent watchmaking house, very different from and very separate from the brands they customize like Rolex. The level of detail they go into is far greater than that I've ever seen from a custom watch making house like Bamford, etc., other brands. These guys really are incredibly talented, incredibly skilled, and the level of customizations they are doing are actually in some ways better than the actual brand is, better attention to detail and better craftsmanship and skill level than the actual brand like Rolex themselves, which is kind of unheard of. The customizations they do are actually made to order. They're custom to order, and they don't make any watches and stock them like lots of other custom watch brands do. These guys just make them when you request them to make a piece. Every single customization they've done or model they've created is a completely limited edition. It's a limited run. They only make it in a certain number of watches. For example, this one that we're looking at here today is limited to 15 watches worldwide. And the reason it's limited is because of the process they did with the dials, which was quite a complex process, and only a certain amount of dials were able to be created. So each watch has its own story and is limited to a certain number, which is really, really nice. So let's have a look at the features on this watch. That kind of concludes a look at Artisans De Geneve. So the features of this watch, this model is based off the 6240 Rolex Daytona, which is a vintage Rolex Daytona, and this model has a special tropical dial, which is obviously a copy of what some of the vintage 6240s have. They've created a tropical patina over the years, basically fading with the sun and certain tropical environments, humidities, and that kind of changes the color of the dial a little bit. Lots of those will feature brown dials or a slightly browner tinge. They've gone for a slightly different tone of patina on this watch. It's more of an orange, but we'll come on to that later on. So we're going to start with the clasp, as we always do. The clasp on this watch is obviously pretty much an identical copy to the Oyster clasp on a standard Rolex Daytona. In fact, it is a Oyster clasp. The thing that they've changed on this watch though is they've sandblasted the polished area of this clasp, and now it's a completely matte finish. And then they've also slightly changed on the bracelet and the clasp. The brushed grain is a little bit more of a smoother grain than you see on the standard Rolex, but it's kind of not really noticeable at all. Anyway, I'll come on to that. So yeah, sandblasted on the top or where the polished area is. Personally, I miss the polished area. I think it looks much better than it does with this sandblasted effect. Moving on to the bracelet, we've got a standard Oyster bracelet on this watch with a slightly different grain. It's pretty much identical. A big difference here, obviously, with the Daytona though, is that this one features a all brushed finish or sandblasted finish effect, rather than the standard Daytona, which features a polished center link or features a bracelet with a polished center links. Other than that, the bracelet is identical to the standard one. I actually prefer this brushed, full brush bracelet, which is actually reminiscent of the original 6240 reference anyway, but I prefer how this is a little bit more subtle and a bit more utilitarian feeling than the standard bracelet for the Daytona, which is a bit more polished, a bit more dressy, a bit more in your face. The case on this watch has been altered slightly. So it is sandblasted, the actual case, so it's a slightly different look to the brushed or the polished, or obviously the polished case that you usually get on a Daytona. Again, adding to that more utilitarian feel. We've got polished sides on this case though, and the case is kind of elongated and thinned out versus the standard Daytona. It has a really different feel to the standard Daytona. The lugs and all the changes that they've done to the case has all been done by hand by them in the workshop, which is why it's kind of not so cost effective for them to do multiple batches, because the production is not done by a machine, so therefore they kind of limit the production numbers because it takes a long time to create each watch. So yeah, the case is finished by hand. You'll notice obviously the lack of crown guards as well on this watch, which completely changes the look of the piece, gives it definitely a much more vintage feel. We've got a different crown on this watch as well, a much more compact, squished in pancake style crown, again reminiscent of the original 6240, and our pushers are much bigger on this watch, also reminiscent of a 6240. So that side of the watch, the crown side of the watch, definitely feels like a real vintage, classic, beautiful Rolex Daytona from the late 60s. Moving now onto the back of the watch, we're going to take a look at the case back. So usually on these watches, and all Rolex watches really ever, have featured a steel case back, so a completely locked off case back. The reason being is because their movements aren't really about beauty, and they're finished to a real much more rougher standard than something like Patek or Audemars Piguet, which is about the beauty of the movement. Rolex is really about the reliability. It's much more of a utilitarian feel to their movement, so they've never displayed them with a clear crystal case back. Whereas this watch features a clear crystal case back, and Artisans De Geneve has removed the standard rotor on the Rolex movement and replaced it with their 22 karat gold rotor. Each one is hand engraved and they look really, really cool. It kind of ties in nicely with the patina that we have on the dial. Moving now up onto the bezel of this watch, we've got a Bakelite bezel, which is again really similar to the original 6240 reference. That Bakelite bezel will slowly wear away with time because it will scratch. It's much softer than ceramic, so that will add a little bit of character to that bezel over time. We've got kind of a silver or steel lip around it, which feels really nice, looks again really similar to the original 6240. Now moving on to our crystal, we actually have a plexiglass crystal on this watch, which is again also going to tarnish with time, scratch up, and give the watch a real vintage feel, which is just going to look so cool. It's really nicely domed. It reminds me a little bit of the Speedmaster crystal, which I really love, the Hesalite on those Speedmasters. So yeah, this is actually one of my favorite features of this watch, that plexiglass crystal. Moving now onto our dial, we've got quite a few changes on this dial. This is actually where you'll see probably the most changes on the whole watch. The most noticeable bit of this dial or change is actually our patinaed kind of orangey brown subdials. Now these are actually naturally patinaed, and it's actually part of the main reason why this watch was limited to only 15 pieces. The bezel, also the actual dials, were shipped off to the Bahamas and placed in the sun for quite a long time. And in the certain kind of tropical environment, these have created a natural oxidation. Artisans De Geneve have found a way to make the dials naturally patina, naturally fade, and naturally oxidize to create this beautiful orangey brown tone. But it is a genuine patina. It's not faked. It's not sprayed on or painted. It is a real patina from the Bahamas, from the actual real sun and that more humid climate. So it is a really amazing thing to see. The fact that they've actually done it naturally adds to the kind of characteristic of this watch. And the great thing as well is because it's natural, each individual dial in this set of 15 watches that they've created in this 6240 tropical reference, each individual subdial or each dial will feature a slightly different tone of orange or brown. And that makes each one completely unique, which is really cool. One thing that I'd say that I wish they would do on this watch though is I wish they'd made it a bit more of an uneven patina. They've taken real pride in the fact they've created an even patina, which is a really difficult thing to do, but I actually prefer slightly uneven patina. I think it gives the watch more character, and that would make each watch totally different from one another. If each, obviously here we're seeing just a slightly different tone of orangey brown per watch, but actually if each watch featured a different pattern on that patina would be even cooler in my opinion. But nonetheless, a really cool little addition here. That's kind of the centerpiece of this watch, is those patinaed subdials, naturally patinaed subdials. Moving now onto our hands and our markers and the actual dial, we've got a beautiful silvery kind of creamy actual dial with a sunburst effect. It's beautiful, really adds to that vintage feel, ties in really nicely with those browny orange subdials, just has a kind of warmer tone to the whole piece, which is just really nice and definitely reminiscent of a kind of faded patina dial on a reference 6240. The hands and the actual indexes have been slightly changed on this watch too to match the original 6240. Everything about this watch is to try and match and replicate, but in a nice way, though, those original references. So yeah, that kind of concludes our features of this watch. On to whether or not I would own this piece. I think I would definitely own this piece. I'm not a strong, I'm not a real fan of custom watches myself, but I can really see the appeal of watches from this company, Artisans De Geneve, because this watch really features some real attention to detail. It tells a real story. There's the dial, the care they've put into that, creating that natural patina is much more interesting to me than PVC black coating a whole watch and changing the color of the hands. I just think there's some real care and attention and passion that's gone into this piece that is totally different to lots of other brands out there. And I think that's why this company is regarded in the industry as one of the more respected custom watch houses versus some of the other brands out there. And the fact they keep them nice and limited is a really nice feature as well. I think really to summarize though, about this brand, Artisans De Geneve, and their watches in general, is what really appeals to me the most about these watches from them is the fact that this is really a Rolex at the end of the day, but this is a Rolex now with character and soul. And standard Rolexes, like the standard Daytona that this has been kind of formed from, has no soul in my opinion, and not really much character. Rolexes are machines. They're like a Mercedes. They don't really have much character or difference between each one because every single one is created by a machine, and that's why I prefer other brands like Patek, which I feel has more passion and soul that's been put into them. This, for me, feels like a human hand has touched this watch and created it. And that's why I think this is actually one of the coolest watches if you're looking at Rolex to buy, because this is history and also real passion and watchmaking, but along with amazing reliability and strength and hard-wearing features that a Rolex has. Thanks guys for watching. Let us know in the comments what you think about this Artisans De Geneve 6240 tropical reference. Would you own this watch, or would you own any of the other models in their collection? Probably their most famous one is the Montoya with a skeletonized Daytona actual dial, which looks really cool. That's their most famous version. I think this is one of their most beautiful versions though. Let us know what you think. Do you think recreating vintage watches is not good, or do you like it? I think it's actually great that we can combine the modern technology of a modern watch and replicate that older vintage look. Of course it's not a vintage watch, but that's not what Artisans De Geneve is trying to do. Let us know in the comments if you're interested in this watch as well, or don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are in the description, or also at the end of the video. It would be a pleasure to try and assist you to get one of these Artisans De Geneve watches. This model is actually for sale from us as well. Thanks guys for watching.